Well, thank everyone for coming. I have a lot of family here and a lot of friends here, and it's just great to see everybody. Here? So we just lowered it. How's this? Sound good? Much better? Okay. I'll talk. I'll try to speak more loudly. It's really nice to be back in Chicago. Obviously, I was born here, I was raised here, but I've been living in New York City for the last 15 years or so. And it was very challenging writing a book about Chicago in New York, mainly because New Yorkers don't believe that, anything outside of New York matters. So I had a lot of trouble convincing my press, that it was worthwhile to write a book about Chicago. And that was one of the reasons that there's the word Chicago is not in the title, it's not in the subtitle. They were trying to hide that it was actually a book about Chicago because they thought, who cares? Nobody even knows where it is, and, that sort of thing. So, and I went along finally after fighting it out a bit, deciding that at least they would let the book be about Chicago. So that was something, but, so after all this struggle with me and, fighting me about the title and the subtitle, they finally, around November, started to say, maybe Chicago, maybe it's kind of interesting. After all, they just started to have these second thoughts. And so, I just want to let you all be the first to know that the paperback will be called Obama's Chicago, race, real estate, and the exploitation of black urban America. So, they've finally come along, and it's better late than never. But, it was a challenge, but, I think ultimately they saw that the story of what happened here, really mattered and really exemplified things that happened all across the country in the urban north after World War II, as neighborhoods changed really quickly and dramatically from white to black. So I just want to talk a little bit about the book. What my book deals with is a question that is quite contentious among historians anyway, which is the question of why so many urban neighborhoods in the North changed so rapidly from white to black in the 1950s, usually, 1950s and 60s, and why they quickly decayed as well. And I offer an explanation for both the rapid change and the rapid decline of many of these neighborhoods that challenges the conventional wisdom, and I'm going to talk about that. But first I want to say a little bit about how the book originated. What I'll actually talk most about here tonight is my father, Mark J. Satter, it was my curiosity about him that really launched this book. My father was a Jewish Chicago attorney with a largely black working-class clientele. He was 49 when he died. He had a heart ailment, and he died in 1965 when I, the youngest of his 5 children, was 6. As I grew older, I picked up very mixed messages about my father from my relatives. On one hand, they told me that he had been a well-known crusader for the oppressed and that I should be proud of him. But they also spoke in quieter tones about some properties that he had owned in what is now a black ghetto. What they said was that he'd hoped that these properties would provide for his family, but that the properties had instead become worthless. I learned that they were sold shortly after his death, and that by then they were worth so little that their sale hadn't covered that winter's coal bills. That was the common, I heard that many times. It didn't even cover the coal bills. It didn't even cover the coal bills. And I understood that somehow my relatives felt that it was my father's fault that this had happened. So there was a mystery there, and there was something I needed to know. But it was only in the summer of 2000 that I actually began to investigate my father's story. What had happened, the reason I was able to do this was because shortly after my father died, my older brother, Paul Satter, had made scrapbooks out of our father's papers. These scrapbooks contained my father's speeches and correspondence, newspaper articles he had written and articles that had been written about him, and reports about his legal cases. And so when I first decided I wanted to learn about my father, I just started to read these scrapbooks. And I was really shocked by the stories that they contained. What I learned from them was that my father had represented scores of African Americans who had been unconscionably misled and grossly overcharged by real estate agents that they had turned to for help in purchasing property. I'll give you a typical example. In 1956, a white real estate agent named Jay Goran bought a building for $3,000. A few weeks later, he sold it to a black couple, William and Wilma Coleman, for $12,000. Now, Goran claimed to be merely a real estate agent. He never told the Colemans that he was actually the building's owner. The Colemans signed some complicated documents that said that the building would remain the legal property of its current unknown owner until they had paid off the property in full. They made their high monthly payments for about a year. They spent another $3,000 on repairs. Then they missed a payment and were evicted from the property. The owner, Jay Goran, was now free to resell the property while keeping everything that the Colemans had invested in it. Now, in part, the Colemans lost their home and their savings because of the policies of the Federal Housing Administration, which redlined, that is, refused to insure mortgages in neighborhoods that contained even a small number of black residents. Now, many urban historians know this and have written about this, that the fact that FHA redlining made it close to impossible for most African Americans to buy a home with a mortgage. Instead, they were forced to deal with real estate speculators who bought low from whites and sold high to blacks. But what historians actually never answered was a kind of central question, which is, given that blacks couldn't get mortgages, how were they able to buy properties at high prices? And the trap that caught my father's clients basically gives the answer to that question. Unable to get a mortgage, the Colemans bought their buildings on contract, which essentially means on an installment plan. So what this meant was that they made a down payment. They were also responsible for taxes, insurance, interest, and maintenance. However, they couldn't get the title to the property until the purchase price had been paid off in full. With just one missed payment, the speculator could reclaim the building, and with housing prices wildly inflated, a missed payment and subsequent quick eviction was quite likely. And I have with me a blank version of a typical article of agreement for warranty deed, which was the legal name for a contract sale deed. And in very, very small print, number 13 of the 25 subsets, it says, oh, and if you miss a payment, the owner can throw you out and keep everything. So that's where they set it. Now, prices, in fact, were wildly inflated. White speculators routinely sold properties to African Americans for about double the property's value. However, sales of triple to quadruple the property's value were not uncommon either. And this was a very widespread thing. By the 1950s, contract selling was common in many American cities where black populations had skyrocketed as a result of post-World War II migration from the South. When you consider that approximately 85% of the properties that were sold to black Chicagoans were sold on contract, and that there were close to 1 million black people in Chicago by the mid-1960s, you can get a sense of the scale of the exploitation involved in these contract sales. Now, some of you might wonder why black Chicagoans would be willing to buy overpriced properties on contract. You might wonder, didn't they see that they were being overcharged? You know, why were they willing to go along with it? And to understand that, you need to know something about the situation facing black Chicagoans in the post-World War II years, which is a period that historians call the Second Great Migration. So I'm just going to talk to you for like a minute or two as a historian to give you that background. Between 1940 and 1960, Chicago's black population skyrocketed from approximately 278,000 to approximately 813,000. So that means the population almost tripled. But most of this immense population was squeezed into the old South Side Black Belt, a neighborhood that had been severely overcrowded even before the Second Great Migration started.